R.G. LeTourneau was a businessman during the Great Depression, and he dropped out of school when he was 14, but he actually went on anyway to invent these machines that would change the world. He invented 70% of the earth-moving equipment that was used during World War II. So a lot of people would just be focused on building a business and making money, and that would be sort of the fulfillment of their hopes. But for him, that was just a part of what he wanted and the legacy he ultimately left behind. His mission and what he wanted to do was to point people to Jesus, and that was in everything that he tried to do, including in his business. He tried to live out the verse from Matthew. It says, "But seek first his kingdom and his righteousness, and all these things will be given to you as well." He wanted to go into full-time ministry at one point, and he went to his pastor who gave him some advice and said, "God needs businessmen too." So he focused on his inventions, and he created huge profits for his company using his heavy equipment for road construction and leveling. Within a few years, he had moved from a small amount of money to more than $1 million in income. So in 1935, LeTourneau's wife decided to suggest to him an idea that sounds kind of radical, which was to stop giving 10% to God, but to give 90%, and for them to keep only 10% of his income. After that, Mr. LeTourneau was fond of saying, "It's not how much of my money I give to God, but it's how much of God's money that I keep for myself." So sometimes LeTourneau would do things that drove his accountants crazy. Like just before the Great Depression, they had this construction job and it went bad, and his company was left with $100,000 in debt. But he worked to pay back that debt, and not only that, he had already pledged $5,000 to missions that year, and he insisted his company fulfilled that pledge. So when World War II began, the military started calling up men to serve in the military as chaplains, and LeTourneau saw this and decided to do the same thing for his workers in his factories and plants. He decided to use company time and his own money, and he hired 3 full-time chaplains to serve in his manufacturing plants. LeTourneau called this Christianity with its sleeves rolled up. That choice to share his faith with his workers had long-lasting effects on their lives. And if that was just a story, then that would be a great story and a way to share your faith. But for me, it has more importance because Mr. LeTourneau's choices to share his faith with his workers affected my family. My grandfather grew up and was a teenager during the time of the Depression. And as best I know from his family, I think they may have called themselves Christians, but they weren't actively living out their faith, and they did not go to church. So my pop-pop, after he was discharged from the military in World War II, went to work for one of LeTourneau's plants in Toccoa, Georgia. They actually started a program when he was there that would let you make a choice at lunchtime. You could decide if you wanted to go off and have lunch on your own as you normally would, or you could be paid for your lunchtime, and you could also go to a Bible study during that lunchtime. And he chose to do that, probably for financial reasons. And it was through that Bible study, probably led by one of those chaplains, that he decided to surrender his life to Christ and became a Christian. After his conversion and encountering God through the Bible study at LeTourneau's plant, then my father's life was exposed to God at a younger age and made different choices in his life probably because of that. And then for me, that looked like us from really as far back as I can remember being involved in church and being exposed to God. But I remember being a little girl, and I would be at my pop-up's house, and he would talk to me about R.G. LeTourneau as a kid, and I just think it's crazy to think of how one man's choices, they've been so far-reaching, and how even long past his death, they kind of still live on today in us.
What a guy. It's such a pleasure to work at the university that he founded. Interestingly, he had a 7th grade education, but he founded this university that is probably the premier polytechnic engineering school in Christian education today. And it's such a pleasure to work there. And it's also a pleasure to be here in the Lynchburg area. You know, you guys have been so hospitable. Last night, when John Pennington was driving us around, he found out I was from Texas. And he decided, hey, if you're from Texas, you should love horseback riding. And so he said, we're going to take you horseback riding. So we went horseback riding last night. And it was great, except I almost didn't make it here. I slipped out of the saddle. My foot caught in the stirrup. Any of you who are equestrians know how dangerous that can be. And if John hadn't found the manager of Walmart to unplug that thing, I wouldn't be here. That's really not true. But you guys have been very gracious. Thank you so much for this opportunity. Well, my privilege is to talk about a theology of work to start about. Now, how many times have y'all started the morning thinking about theology here? Well, my job is not to bore you to death. I think this is one of the most exciting things that I've ever learned myself personally, and I want to share that with you because it forms the basis of everything that we're going to do and talk about today. So let's talk about that today. So how do you view work? That's my first question. You know, there are some people that just love their work, they whistle while they work, and then there are other people that just hate it. In fact, Gallup says that about 71% of the workers in the United States are just putting in time, sadly. Is that how you look at work? How do you look at work here? Most people, though, have a huge disconnect when it comes to trying to figure out how in the world God fits into the workplace. And sometimes those of us who are theologically trained haven't helped you do that very much. And I'm just so excited that the churches here in Lynchburg are starting to talk about that a lot more. And so we want to help you do that. R.G. LeTourneau was actually one of those guys, and he almost missed his calling because he doubted the value of building these gigantic earth-moving machines that he was doing. But that's not a historical anomaly. If you think about it, and you go back and study work in history, you see here that people really defined themselves by what they didn't do in ancient times. And as work was something that was considered evil. So if you had any means at all, you never did any kind of physical labor. You hired people or you bought slaves and they did all the work. I mean, all of the work. And you sat around and philosophized and talked about religion all the time. That's because they looked at work as something that was terrible. It was a curse that came upon man for whatever reason, or an accident of nature, or something that the gods did to punish us. Whatever it was, they did not have a positive view of work. But today we look at work a little bit differently. Work is how we justify our existence. If work is going great, we feel really good, right? But if something bad happens, how do we feel? We feel really bad. And today, we're the most workaholic nation and culture, in fact, our whole world is like this to a large extent, that has ever existed in human history. We work all the time. I love my electronic gadgets, but they allow us to work anywhere, right? But then that means we can work anytime as well, and it just kind of usurps our lives. And so work can be this incredibly beautiful thing, but it can also be a thing that drives us into the ground in some ways. There's another view of work that I want us to talk about. And this, if you've been to church, if you've grown up in church, if you're a Christian, you may have developed this for whatever reason. It certainly was where I was years ago. Work is a necessary evil. You think, okay, I've got to do it. I've got to do this work, and God didn't allow me to be a preacher or a missionary or pastor, so I've got to go out there and earn my living in the workplace. And we end up defining ourselves what we do for God. Now, that's great, okay? I want us to do that. But unfortunately, we have a really narrow view of what working for God really means. There are two worlds, right? And there's this divide between them. There are things that God's interested in, and there are things that man's interested in. And they don't ever come together to a lot of people. So what would you think is over here under God's interest? Well, you can probably name them. There's prayer, Bible study, evangelism, worship, serving the poor. Those all qualify, right? But what about this other stuff over here, like business and politics and banking and building houses and running electrical wire and engineering and accounting and also changing diapers? Does that have any meaning to God? Is that anything that's important to him? Well, I hope that you'll see when we finish that actually there is no divide between these things in God's mind, and he wants us to see that we're living in one world, not trying to live in two worlds here. This is a pagan, not a Christian point of view altogether. And so there's some pretty dastardly results of looking at life like this. Number one, people go to work feeling unequipped to live for God. I mean, we just are not ready for that. Secondly, Faith becomes a private matter, something you keep to yourself. And especially when you go in public or when you go into the workplace, you kind of want to leave that at home, especially when you walk through the door of your work. And then lastly, we see ourselves as insignificant, see our work as insignificant, and therefore we see ourselves as insignificant to God. I mean, if God really doesn't care about what happens Monday through Saturday, I mean, just really how spiritual do you need to be, okay? Just come to church, sit in the pew, drop a 20 in the plate, and don't give your pastor any trouble. And if that's the highlight of your spiritual life, ladies and gentlemen, it probably is because you have a faulty theology of work, which hopefully I can help you understand what the Bible says about work just a little bit. One of the fellows years ago told me, I grew up in a church where if you wanted to be a 4-star Christian, you had to be a missionary. You could be a 3-star Christian if you're a pastor. That's awesome. And if you went to Liberty, hey, you got a 2-star Christian status here. But if you didn't go to a Christian school and you're working at a secular job, you're stuck with being a 1-star Christian all of your life. Yikes. So what is work like for you? Is it a blessing or a curse? Is it something that you just do to earn a living, or it's just a platform for evangelism and that's its only value, or it's a way to make money to support God's work, or is it a holy calling and a key way we worship God and serve our fellow man? I hope that you see when we finish that this is the way God would like us to see work. Mr. LeTourneau, as the video pointed out, was a young man in business. He loved his work. He did a lot of earth moving, and then he started inventing these incredible machines. And but when he dedicated his life for Christ, he actually thought that he would need to become a missionary or a pastor. His sisters, were really Green Berets for Jesus. They'd gone off to China right after the Boxer Rebellion, and he thought that is where he was going to go when he dedicated his life to Christ, because he had this view of if you really wanted to serve God, if you really were all in, you were in some kind of vocational ministry. But as the video mentioned here, when he went to his pastor and they prayed together about this, his pastor told him, Bob, God needs businessmen as much as he needs pastors and missionaries and evangelists. And so Mr. LeTourneau said, all right, if that's what God wants me to be, I will be his businessman. And look at what he says here. Later on in life, he wrote this. He said, if I had a religion that limped along during the week and maybe worked only on Sundays or while you're in church, I don't think I'd be very sold on it. And actually, if you look at work like that, I don't think anybody's very sold on it, quite frankly. I think I'd turn it in for a new model that worked 7 days a week, that would work when I was at the church, in my home, or at the plant. And he says, and that's what Christianity does. That is the Christian faith that we find in the Scripture. So what's your career objective? Is it to follow Christ, becoming and meaning that you're going to door number one is that you're going to go through and look at life like that and say, okay, if I really want to be serious about Christ, I've got to leave my business and go be trained for some kind of vocational ministry? Or door number two, does it mean following Christ like this, seeing your work as a holy calling, claiming your workplace as your mission field, and becoming a full-time follower of Christ in the workplace? I want to urge you that door number two is the way we should do that. Well, it's one thing for you to think about work, but really what we want to do is to figure out how God thinks about work, right? Because that's what counts. So how does God really think about work? But before we do that, let me give you a little quiz, okay? Just so you'll understand the preponderance of work in the Bible. So what does the Bible say more about work or worship, do you think? I kind of clued you in. What do you think? Work. It's work. That's exactly right. There's a ton more about work than actually formal worship in the Bible. Now, this is really interesting. If you put all the heroes of the Bible out, how would this weigh out? Would they be more clergy type, or would they be people out in the workplace, do you think? In the workplace, that's exactly right. If you look at actually who wrote the Bible, it's incredible. There were about 75% of the people that we consider Bible heroes made their living just like you do, out in the real world, not behind a pulpit, not being a prophet or a priest or whatever. Amazing thing. All right, so we don't usually think of people like this sometimes, but here's some Bible heroes. I've got a few of them here. So can you identify this guy here? Reared in the family ranching business, his jealous brothers had him kidnapped and taken foreign country, where he eventually rose to a top government position and saved the Near East from famine by savvy grain futures trading. Who's this? Joseph. Oh, you guys are good. Excellent. Okay, good. Son of a humble sheep rancher. He was a musical prodigy, and to the surprise of all, he became a great military leader and later the supreme ruler of his country. Who's that? David. Okay. Wow, the guy who wrote all the Psalms was out in the real workplace here. In a day when women were, this is tricky now, okay? This was tricky. In a day when women were considered baby factories, she executed several entrepreneurial ventures in real estate and textiles while maintaining excellent management of her family estate. The Proverbs 31 woman, whatever her name was, she was awesome, okay? And then lastly, he had the most promising young mind in the Jewish legal community. Later, he made a career move into manufacture of portable housing, allowing him greater flexibility in his work to spread the gospel. Who's that? Paul. Boom. Have you ever thought of these guys like that? This is, pitching them in their what we call secular vocation. But even when we look at Jesus, it's really amazing. Where did Jesus spend most of his time? In his ministry or in his small business? In the carpentry shop. Wow, you know this. He spent way more time in his small business, about 10% in his ministry, and 90% of his life, either growing up or working in the carpentry shop. Now, I don't know about you, but if God had sent me to save the world, would you waste time, like that? If what he was doing in the carpentry shop was not important? I don't think so. That ought to give us a clue immediately that God thinks the workplace is a pretty important place. And look at Jesus' parables. There's 37 of them. There's some repeated, but there's 37 actual distinct parables in the Gospels. And so how many of them do you think have a workplace setting? Way more. Look at this. This is amazing. Out of 37, only 5 take place outside the workplace. 32 of them actually take place in the workplace. So, wow. So, okay, what does all this say about work as far as God is concerned? We need to reframe work. And there are 4 things I want us to see here. Number 1, work is a gift of God, essential for human flourishing. It is a way we express our love for Him and our fellow man. That it's the proving ground of our faith, and the workplace is actually the most strategic mission field in the world today, and actually, quite frankly, since the early church, it has been. So let's take a look at this. First of all, work is a gift of God, essential for human flourishing. Now, this ought not to surprise us, but it often does. We're so familiar with Genesis that this doesn't shock us when we see this. God is actually a worker. In Genesis 1, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Now, if you lived in ancient times, you would go nuts reading this because this is scandalous. A God who actually makes things and cares about the physical world? I mean, goodness gracious, that is a shocking thing that doesn't hit us sometimes the same way. But God is a worker himself. He spoke, and 10 to the 50th tons of matter showed up in the universe. I mean, he cares about this stuff. He made it. And he has, in some ways, his hands in the dirt. And he uses, in Genesis 2, the very same word that he uses for God's work is also the work that the Bible uses for human work as well. And so it's not a surprise that when God created us in his image, guess what? We're going to be workers made in the image of God. And he says here in Genesis 1:27, God created man in his own image. And look at this next verse in 28. And God blessed them and said, be fruitful, multiply, fill the earth, and subdue it. There's a 4-fold direction there that God gives us here. Be fruitful actually means productive. Multiply means have babies, because it's going to take more than you and Adam and Eve to do this. Fill the earth actually means to bring it to full flower. In other words, take all the resources and all the knowledge that I'm implanting in your brain and will continue to expand and make something of this world. Make it better than it was when you brought it here. And then subdue it, bring it under God's control here. I take it that the world was perfect, but it was wild as well. And so it needed to be dominated. And God gave Adam and Eve the opportunity and the privilege and the authority to actually command creation. Something we lost, by the way, obviously at the fall. And yet this is why work can be so frustrating, because we know we want to make things work. And oftentimes it doesn't because of the fall. Work is a gift of God. It is essential for human flourishing. It can be frustrating at times. But the fact is, Genesis 1 sets this very clearly up to us, that work is a gift of God. Mr. LeTourneau had a very interesting way of looking at this. Y'all seen this picture, but here's what he said about this. He said, when God created the world and everything in it, he didn't mean for us to stop there and say, hey, God, great, you've done it all. There's nothing left for us to build. He wanted us to take off from there and really build for his greater glory. He actually thought these machines that he was making were part of fulfilling Genesis 1:28. Not just the money he made that he gave away, not just his personal evangelism, but the actual work that he did in running LeTourneau Industries actually served God's purpose. And that's exactly what Genesis 1 tells us. Work is a gift of God. Secondly, work is an expression of our love for God and for our neighbor. Look at this. You know the great commandment, right? You love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your strength. And your mind.
It's in the crowd.
And your neighbor as yourself, okay? I'm not sure what that was, but hey. Okay, so what does that mean when you think about this? What does that have to do with the workplace? Have you ever thought about that? Well, God wants us to think about it. In Colossians chapter 3, he says, slaves, which were really the employers of the day, obey your earthly masters in everything and do it not with their eyes upon you to win their favor, but with sincerity of heart and reverence for the Lord. What is that? Work is actually a way we worship God, reverence for the Lord. But it's also a way that we serve our fellow man as well. The actual work you do, if it's legitimate work. There's certain things, by the way, that don't fit this last phrase here. Whatever you do, work at it with all your heart as working for the Lord. You know what the Greek word for whatever means, don't you? Whatever. Thank you. Good. We have a Greek scholar in their midst. Whatever. So, okay, that means every kind of work that you could possibly think of, unless, something that's inherently evil, like pimping, prostitution, drug dealing, bank robbing, those kind of things. Those don't work. I don't care why you do that, okay? C.S. Lewis said, no clever arrangement of bad eggs ever makes a good omelet. But other kinds of work are incredibly important to God, and they all fit within his directive in Genesis chapter 1 here. And it's a way that we actually fulfill the great commandment. I don't know if you've ever thought about that, but it's the way we love God, and it's a significant way that we love our fellow man by creating things, products, services, work that serves people's legitimate human needs. That's working for God. So the third thing that I see when I look at the scripture is that work is a proving ground for our faith. It is the place. Let me talk to any pastors. Y'all know the word spiritual formation. That's a fancy word for discipleship. Okay, our spiritual growth is dominated by what happens in the workplace. If we take God to work and he is the Lord there, it is going to mean an incredible difference in our spiritual life. It is going to be hugely transformative to our own spiritual growth. And if we don't, ladies and gentlemen, we stunt our spiritual growth forever if we never see this and never understand this. Matthew says, no one can serve two masters. Either he will hate one, love the other, or he'll be devoted to one and despise the other. You can't serve God and money. In a fallen world, you see, work can really become an idol, can it, right? Because that's why we're trying to receive, that's what we're trying to trying to, justify our own existence by, and it won't ever work. And work forces us either to trust God or to trust ourselves. And in that decision, where that takes place, we either grow or we stunt our spiritual life. I love what Psalm 127 says here. This is something I've had to learn the hard way, and maybe most people do. Work is where we learn to trust God. Psalm 127 says, unless the Lord builds the house, what? They labor in vain. How many of you are in construction here? Anybody construction in some way? Unless the Lord is in your operation, it's not going to work, okay? Unless the Lord is there in that, you labor in vain. The watchman, anybody in law enforcement or government or any of those here, there's a few of you there. Unless the watchman keeps awake in vain, it is vain to rise up early, retire late, to eat the bread of painful labor for the Lord. Look at this. How many of you work in business where you actually try to generate income? Okay? There's a few of you here? Okay. So what does he say here? It's vain to rise early and eat the bread of painful labor, because why? The Lord gives to his beloved even in your sleep. This is under his control because he cares about work. This is not just in your hands. And understanding that and realizing that is incredibly important for our spiritual growth. Well, not only that, but workplace is an incredible mission field as well. The reality of our faith is actually demonstrated most strongly where we actually spend time with non-Christians. So ask yourself that question. Where do you spend the most time, or let's turn it around the other way. Where do non-Christians tend to spend most time with people that know the gospel message? It's in the workplace. And by the way, that's historically true throughout the New Testament and down to our age. Have you ever read in the book of Acts and in the epistles or somewhere it says, and the gospel spread from house to house? You remember that? You know what the word house is? It's the word oikos. And oikos, yeah, it's a house, okay? But it's also an establishment. It is the basic economic unit of the Greco-Roman world. And so what we're being told there is the gospel spread from business to business along lanes of commerce. That's how the gospel spread throughout the Mediterranean world, through the workplace. This is certainly true. Colossians tells us two things here. Be wise in the way you do what to outsiders? How you act toward outsiders, right? So our behavior, how we treat people, what we say to them is incredibly important. So in the workplace, if I'm treating people right, if I am demonstrating godliness to them, if I am doing excellent work, by the way, because God deserves that, then people notice. So wisdom in the way we act, but also in the way we talk here. He says, let your conversation always be gracious, seasoned with salt, so that you'll know how to answer anyway. Ladies and gentlemen, there's a book in your bag here that's a gift from LeTourneau University that a physician I wrote several years ago that basically explains how to be wise in the way you talk to non-Christians in the workplace. It's been taught, these principles have been taught all over the world to thousands and thousands of people. And I just urge you to think about how you do that, because the workplace is the most strategic place to influence people to come to Christ. It is also the place where non-Christians get turned off worse than any other place. If they don't see us working in integrity and with high ethical standards. So where do we get the ability to do this, to live like this? That's a question that I suspect you're asking there. Says, whoa, if God looks at the world like this and he looks at business like this, wow, I think that's in some ways kind of beyond me here. Can I really do this? And I want to remind you that Jesus made a contract with us, and he entered into a business deal with us, and he says, I'm going to trade your poverty for my wealth. And he gave us on the cross the ability to have a relationship with God that's not just about forgiveness, it's about God's life coming in with us. He truly made us rich, ladies and gentlemen, at the cross of Jesus Christ. When we put our trust in him and what he did there, we trade our poverty for his wealth. And look at what Ephesians 3:20 says. It says, now to him who is able to do immeasurably more than we ask or imagine, according to the power where? That's within us. Yeah. That power of the gospel is resident in us. And we can do our work for the glory of God, no matter how hard it is, no matter how difficult it is, no matter how many reversals we have because it's a fallen world. We can still do our work and our business to the glory of God because he is there, he cares about it, and he shows up every day before you get there and says, hey, let's go to work together in this place of work. As you do excellent work, as you demonstrate godly character, as you care about people and you communicate wisely, people pay attention. So we've got two choices here. Which door are you going to open here? If you're really serious about God, what you going to choose? Door number one? I hope not, because that's not a biblical view of work. Door number two, following Christ means taking your faith to work, seeing your work as a holy calling and becoming a full-time follower of Christ in the workplace. God has plans for you, ladies and gentlemen. You are his creation. He created you for what you're doing. And so let's draw upon that power. And I don't care what you are, an engineer, a teacher, a doctor, a scientist, an architect, construction worker, even a banker. Oh my goodness, yes. Absolutely. You can do your work for God. So here are some of the Monday morning realities that we have. Number one, we take our faith to work. When we take our faith to work, even the most mundane task becomes spiritually significant. Wow. Even the things you don't like to do, they're spiritually significant. The things you love to do, spiritually significant. Everything. Secondly, work is not a distraction from your spiritual life. I want you to see, it really is the key to your spiritual life. If you're not taking God to work intentionally in your mind, it will warp your spiritual life significantly. And thirdly, we go to work for the same reason we go to church, actually. Do you realize this? To worship God and to serve our fellow man. That, ladies and gentlemen, is a biblical theology of work, and it will change your life. Thank you very much.